right, I just got back from the courtroom where Do Kwon made his first appearance in front of the judge that will be presiding over his case, and it was very weird because I haven't seen Do in person for a little over 2 years now, which is pretty crazy to say. But he looked almost like an entirely different person in the yellow jumpsuit and shackles as the same U.S. Marshals, weirdly enough, that escorted Sam Bankman-Fried during his trial, also escorted Do Kwon to consult with his attorneys. So just want to recap everything that we saw in the courtroom, since video cameras aren't allowed in there, just to walk through what today was all about. It was the initial conference where the judge heard from prosecutors and the defense to land on a trial date, which is now set for January 2026, and to potentially walk through what might be disallowed, what could be allowed, and how they're all going to proceed before that eventual trial date. So just want to give you a recap, and as always, if you haven't yet, I think most of the facts that have been included in this indictment and the 9 charges, potentially fully 9 charges, that Do Kwon could face, facing a maximum of 130 years in prison. We've already covered most of it, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it in our initial exclusive back after that Terra collapse, Coinage being the first to interview Do Kwon on camera. In that collapse, if you haven't watched our award-winning documentary yet, I would suggest that to get caught up on everything about Terra, though it might not include everything that is included in this case and potentially the trial when it begins in 2026. And you might be saying, Zach, that's a really long time to wait. Both sides agreed to that date, prosecutors and the defense. I think more so the defense side, potentially to leave room for a new administration coming into power under Trump. You never really know how aggressive a new district attorney in the most important district when it comes to these crimes is going to be. Potentially Trump might want to go easier on crypto. You never really know. So I get the sense that the defense really wants to budget as much time as possible here. Also, it's the same legal team that just represented Doe in the SEC civil fraud trial, which did not go their way, and they're still dealing with some of the fallout from that settlement with the SEC. But just want to walk through what we heard today because it was about 2 hours in total, as Judge Engelmayer, as we already talked about, is the judge presiding over this. An Obama-appointed judge was swapped in, and swapped out was a Trump-appointed judge. Not entirely clear as to why that happened, but, that is what it is. Judge Engelmayer asked a lot of questions from both prosecutors and the defense, kind of table setting. And that's what these conferences usually are, is just table setting. What are the facts? How quickly can we move? You get a trial date set, and you talk about what potentially could happen with the defendant. In this case, Do Kwon is being held. He was in those shackles, as I mentioned, and really did seem like a different guy. As he walked into the courtroom, it was basically just me, maybe a couple other Korean reporters, an old colleague from CNBC, and not that many other people. It was not at all like the SBF trial, which perhaps is expected since there hasn't been all that much coverage, as most of Terra has happened outside of the States, including where Doe was for the last few years. So not the fanfare of an SBF trial at all, but nonetheless, same kind of interesting dynamics when it comes to the judge mentioning other cases happening right now, including the interlocutory appeal that Coinbase was successful in winning in its case against the SEC, in questions about what are securities and whether or not Luna really constitutes securities fraud, which is one of the charges Doe might face, and whether or not a ruling in that case could potentially impact some of the charges Doe might be going up against. So we'll get into all of that, but just first, let's begin at the beginning. The courtroom where everything just went down is actually in the Thurgood Marshall building, which is separate from the building that SBF was tried in. But it was, weirdly enough, the same courthouse where the OpenSea executive tried in the first ever NFT insider trading case, where he was tried. So somewhat of a weird experience to be back in that courtroom. It was empty when I walked in at 10:30, other than Do Kwon's defense attorney, one of his attorneys there. But as Do walked in, it was kind of weird to see him in the jumpsuit, shackled, ushered in by the same U.S. Marshals that had brought SBF into the courtroom just what was that, last year? So kind of a weird experience to almost be in the same spot with a different crypto tycoon now facing the exact same thing. And locking eyes with Do almost felt like I didn't even recognize the guy that's there now in the courtroom, which was, depending on how you feel about Terra and how it collapsed and whether or not you believe that Do should go to jail, it is a really, just honestly, it's a really weird experience to see someone like that almost not recognize them as they come in a jumpsuit, and you look into their eyes and it just seems different. I honestly don't really know how to process that yet, but that's just kind of the honest, in the moment, what happened. And that all happened as U.S. Marshals were basically telling me to get out of the front row, to leave that for, I don't know, whoever else might be there, or just to leave space between Do and the rest of the courtroom. But immediately the judge walks in. Judge Engelmayer walked into the courtroom, addressed everyone, and Do spoke 3 words throughout this whole hearing. "Good morning, sir," is what he told the judge, and then we were off to the races from there. Essentially, as I said, questions around what should be included, what shouldn't be included were first discussed, including the defense team saying that some of these details shouldn't be included. We saw the same thing play out during the SEC trial, where the defense team really didn't want any specifics around Montenegro or the extradition or the fake passports and why Do was even in jail in Montenegro to be included in this case, as it doesn't really have much to do with the collapse or what's charged. And that was kind of one of those questions that were first discussed before the government got into their initial case. Interestingly, Danielle Sassoon, the same lead prosecutor that took down SBF, was originally listed on the docket but was not present in the courtroom, and the government made mention that she will actually not be involved in this case. Instead, it was prosecutor Jared Lenau taking the lead and will likely be the prosecutor who takes the lead in the Do Kwon case. And he opened just by kind of walking through a lot of the facts that, if you're watching this, you probably don't need to get caught up on, but did try to present to the judge the idea of Do Kwon being a visionary in crypto, not simply someone who was selling a token, like a meme token, or just a token that didn't do anything, but really selling this idea of decentralized finance in what Terra could be if it was successful, and the idea of selling Luna tokens for people like myself and probably others in the coinage community to buy into this, and to have ownership over what potentially could be built on top of Terra. No real need to go into all those details, but eventually did start talking about some of the additional evidence that came in since Do has been extradited to the US, and walked through those potentially 9 counts, felony counts, that Do Kwon will have to defend against. The 9th still to be determined in terms of whether or not that's included, very similar to what happened to SBF, where the Bahamas did not necessarily agree to all the charges that are now included in this indictment, and the 9th one being one of those that Montenegro might need to sign a waiver for. But the other ones, including conspiracy, securities fraud, commodities fraud, market manipulation charges, all of those, 1 through 8, will likely be included regardless. So that's just kind of expectation setting around what is going to be included when the trial gets kicked off in January. For now, it seems to be all 8, potentially 9. The government walked through additional evidence as well, and the size and scope of it is something to be stated off the top, because essentially you've got 6 terabytes of data that the government says is included here. They described it as massive. On top of that, now 4 phones that have been added to the droves of data as well, including 1 phone that was only just confiscated when Do Kwon was extradited. 6 terabytes of data is about 6 times as much as the data that was included in the SEC's case. Bigger by a factor of 6 just on that one piece alone. And the judge actually joked that we're going to have to use a U-Haul to back it up and kind of carry around all of what potentially could be on hand for this case. And the defense also noted that, hey, we're going to need some more time to go through all of that. On top of it, the government mentioned that there is about a handful of recordings that Doe was recorded on that might be new. That was not presented during the SEC case, though some of the messages on Slack with employees were. So potentially also new evidence there for the defense to reckon with. On top of that, the same questions that came up during the SBF original kind of pretrial deliberations involve whether or not Do Kwon's going to be able to have access to all of that data and all of that evidence as well. And so we might see that come up when the next meeting happens in March, whether or not Do Kwon is able to reference all of the evidence and potentially meet with his attorneys effectively to face some of that evidence. And so we could potentially see a lot of motions come in. All of this kind of in that initial hour was just back and forth on, here's the evidence, what do we want to do about it? Does the defense potentially want to make a hint of a motion that could come so the judge is on alert? And the judge did say, okay, I'm on alert for a few of these things, including the idea of, did any of this evidence come potentially in ways that are not permissible, because you are dealing with a bunch of jurisdictions, whether it be Montenegro, South Korea, which has also kind of had their own investigation, and now, on top of the SEC's trial, you have the prosecution here in the U.S. as well. Do Kwon's lead defense attorney, Mike Ferreira, then kind of disputed a couple of the things in the indictment, mainly being, are we getting into multiple charges for the same behavior, including the idea of, if Luna's a security, why are there commodities fraud charges, or potentially vice versa? And you basically had the government saying, look, when people bought Luna, if they were swapping Bitcoin, a commodity, for Luna, a potential security, then you've got both sides of the coin there, both securities fraud, commodities fraud, including the catch-all with wire fraud and the like. But you heard the defense kind of bring up the idea today that if some of the rulings in the other cases, and I mentioned the Coinbase one as an example, if some of those rulings get applied here, then maybe you don't have securities fraud because Luna potentially might not be a security. And then does that charge get dropped? Does it lighten the load for potential maximum sentencing when it comes to prison time? There's still a lot, obviously, in flux, and the defense told the judge that it seemed like the government was presenting somewhat of a catch-all because they're not sure which might stick in the end when it comes to securities fraud versus commodities fraud. And so that was one point of contention brought up in the early innings. The judge noted that, look, this is day one of a long process before potentially getting into a trial at the beginning of next year. So none of these points that were brought up were discussed in great length or in great detail, but kind of interesting to see how this case may potentially fit in to others currently ongoing in crypto. And no doubt, one as large as Terra's will, I think, have ripple effects across the rest of the crypto ecosystem. Even just sitting there watching the OpenSea case in the same courthouse, you do have a lot of questions about what does the first insider trading case for that, in that example for OpenSea, mean for the rest of NFTs and everyone else operating in the same space. So a lot of these cases do have precedent that gets set that I think are pretty important for the rest of the ecosystem, which is why we're dedicating my time. I want to eat Chipotle right now, but not doing it because we're highlighting something that matters a little bit more than lunch. On top of all this, you then did have potentially this back and forth around when this trial should be scheduled and whether or not Doe's defense team was really starting out from, quote, ground zero, as the judge called it, rather than having enough time to go through some of the evidence that may have been included in the SEC's trial, which Doe was not present for, though I was in the courtroom kind of watching some of this play out. And the government said really only 2 out of 5 of the theories around the alleged fraudulent behavior in the Terra case were presented to a jury in that SEC trial. So still 3 prongs, which we've already highlighted in the indictment in our other coverage. So if you haven't yet checked it out, head to coinage.media to watch some of that or read the articles. I'll also link, I think, in the description of this video to that, just to kind of highlight what is different than what was alleged in the civil fraud versus the criminal case. And obviously the criminal case is going to have to include more data and more proof because the government needs to show that Doe acted with criminal intent through all of this, rather than just potentially be found liable for fraud as they were in the SEC case. So, included in this case are allegations tied to Terra's Mirror protocol, which was essentially a Web3 way to gain exposure to US equities, which, as a journalist covering Terra since 2018, always to me seemed to be the ballsiest piece of combining traditional equities with crypto, because it was almost like we don't care at this point. Terra just went and did that anyways, which was always a potential big red flag when it comes to why it was being investigated by the SEC separately all the way back before the collapse even happened, as well as we learned today, potentially also being co-investigated by the DOJ as well, as early as before the Terra collapse even happened. So just interesting to kind of see maybe how much we'll get out of this trial that could be new relative to what we heard in the SEC trial, which of course, as I said, Coinage already covered, so you can go back and look at that coverage, which I'll also link to here. Finally, we got down to exactly when this trial should start, and the opening question was actually presented to the defense, asking them, hey, how much time do you think you might need here? And the defense originally floated a date that I thought I heard wrong, but they mentioned the spring of 2026, more than a year from today. And the judge didn't necessarily seem so taken aback by that, but he did say, I can't remember a trial where I've set something a year out, but I can't imagine a better candidate in reference to this case, for a lot of reasons, as he kind of walked through. One being Do just got out of jail from Montenegro, and so probably wants some time, if he hasn't had the time, to meet with his defense attorneys. That was the question of, hey, have you been in contact with Do since he was in Montenegro? And the defense said, yes, we have, but maybe not to the extent that we should have been in contact with him to prepare for all this, because there were new allegations only recently unsealed in that indictment at the beginning of the year after Do was extradited. So that was one piece of this. The other piece was whether or not Do has had time to think about whether or not he wants to proceed to trial or potentially wait a little bit longer or less. And so the judge asked Do's defense attorneys to confer, talk about this, and if they don't change their mind within the next week, then the trial would be set for January 2026. On top of that, he said it will not be a week later, so very strict in terms of when the judge in this case is setting that date. He also mentioned that there are other off-ramps, kind of a hint towards settling this or potentially changing his plea from not guilty to guilty, discussing with prosecutors whether or not that might be a smart option, which I think is interesting because we just saw that happen with Alex Mashinsky, the founder of Celsius, take a plea deal and admit to some of the charges that he was going to face at trial. Still waiting to hear what the sentencing in that might look like. But for Do, I don't know, you get the sense that this isn't going to be as much of a top priority. You're still waiting on what could potentially happen with the Trump presidency and that administration coming in. You could have entirely different options on the table in just maybe a few weeks' time. And potentially, if you want more time to lobby for that, you don't mind a trial, taking longer to come to fruition, depending on, of course, where you're actually held. For Sam, if you think about his case, he was under home confinement with his parents in Palo Alto for a lot of the time waiting for the trial, before he then published Caroline Ellison's diaries, as we covered, in his trial, and got thrown into MDC, which is where he is now. And so for Do, it doesn't sound like he's being held there. They didn't actually reveal where he's being held, but it sounds like he's more in traditional kind of pretrial jail holdings before potentially getting moved somewhere else. But for the time being, it sounds like the defense is more in the camp of try and draw this out before a trial, keep all our options on the table. Potentially, if under Trump all of this changes, seems like they're leaning into that, and the government had no objection. So the judge set the initial timeline, expectations for this trial to begin in January 2026, which is kind of in line. He made a reference to SBF and how long that took. Sam took like 7-8 months, I think. I think he was extradited November, December is when all that kind of kicked off. And then the trial began late Q4 of the next year. So not really all too different when you think about it. I think obviously the main differences in this case are going to be whether or not some of the complexities are included when it comes to Terra, whether or not a jury can handle that. They seem to be able to handle it in the SEC civil trial, and I guess we'll see if it comes to it whether or not a jury hears any of the defense when it comes to why Doe acted the way he did, which could be very different than the way it has been described in the prosecutor's indictment, and obviously somewhat different than maybe potentially you may think or have thought about in the 2 years since we covered it originally for Coinage back then in 2022. That was pretty much it. As Doe walked out of the courtroom, he was reshackled by the U.S. Marshals, and I locked eyes with him again. At that point, he seemed like he was fine. Throughout this whole process, he was looking at the indictment, talking to his attorneys, so it was not as if it was a defeated Do Kwon. Didn't seem nervous by the end of it. Even kind of looked happy, I think. At least maybe more assured of kind of the process and the way that it just went. But still a lot of questions as to what happens next in this case, and certainly a lot of time even before their next meeting. The next conference between the judge, prosecutors, and Do Kwon's defense team is set for March 6th, which we will cover again for all of you at Coinage. As a reminder, as we did with the SBF trial, if there is an opportunity for us to meet with Doe or present questions that you might have, as always, our NFT holders are included in our coverage. We are a community-owned show at Coinage as a DAO. If you don't have an NFT yet, mint one of those, join what we're building here, and become a member today. And a big shout out to our day one Coinage members who have been here since we dropped that exclusive all the way back in 2022. We've evolved, very excited to be now as we present this, one of the only US-based NFT projects to open a path for dividends. If you have a Coinage NFT, head to coinage.media to complete the full registration process to become a member today. For now, though, that's everything from the courtroom in New York. We'll continue to follow this case. Subscribe if you haven't yet to Coinage and join today.